Today, Avro Lancaster DV-202 exists in two places. Inside the historic Technisches Museum at Peenemünde hangs one of its engines, still attached to a propeller whose blades are visibly bent. It is a large, unmistakable object, the kind of artifact that seems to suggest a complete recovery story. An aircraft was lost. Decades later, its wreckage was found. Then a major component was brought ashore and preserved. But only part of that story is true. A short distance away, in the shallow water of Kilpiensee, the rest of DV-202 never made the same journey. The surviving fuselage remains at the crash site where the Lancaster came down during the Second World War. One part of the bomber is now protected indoors, the other is still in the lake. That division is the central fact of DV-202's survival. It was not recovered and rebuilt. It did not return to the air. There is no verified story of a complete salvage operation that nearly succeeded. What the evidence shows is stranger and more restrained. One major piece came out in 1991, while the aircraft itself remained where 7 men disappeared in August 1943. To understand why that wreck mattered so much, it is necessary to go back to the crew who climbed aboard it. Lancaster DV-202 was a Mark III serving with No. 44, Rhodesia, Squadron of the Royal Air Force. On its final mission, it carried 7 men. Reginald Clifford Harding was the pilot. Thomas Neville Weston served as flight engineer. Leslie Prendergast was the navigator. Leonard Frank McDermott was the bomb aimer. William Henry Quantz was the wireless operator and an air gunner. Stanley Shaw and Peter Piniski were the other air gunners. They were not strangers brought together for a single operation. Records preserved from the squadron show Harding's crew flying a long sequence of missions together during 1943. Their targets had already taken them across occupied Europe. They had flown to places such as Berlin, Essen, Kiel, and Cologne, and farther south to Turin and Milan. By August, the routine of a heavy bomber crew had become familiar to them in the most practical way possible. They had taken off together, crossed hostile airspace together, and repeatedly returned. Harding himself had already been wounded. During a mine-laying operation in April, he was injured badly enough to be out of action for weeks before returning to flying. The crew's surviving record lists 20 operations flown together, ending with Peenemünde. That final target was unlike the industrial cities that dominated so much of Bomber Command's war. On the Baltic coast stood Peenemünde, the German research center associated with the development of new long-range weapons. By the summer of 1943, Allied intelligence had identified it as an important target. Bomber Command planned Operation Hydra for the night of August 17th and 18th. The scale was enormous. Nearly 600 bombers were sent, including more than 300 Lancasters, along with Halifaxes and Stirlings. The attack was organized in waves, with different groups directed at different parts of the site. 40 Bomber Command aircraft were lost that night. DV-202 was one aircraft inside that formation. For Harding and his crew, the size of the force did not make their own task abstract. Whatever was happening across the wider raid, 7 men still had to navigate one Lancaster to the target and then bring it home. The thousands of individual actions inside a bomber operation were compressed into a few basic responsibilities. The pilot had to keep the aircraft under control. The navigator had to know where it was. The bomb aimer had to identify the point at which the aircraft had reached its objective. The wireless operator connected the crew to the wider operation, while the gunners watched the darkness around them. Those roles mattered because a bomber stream was not a single object moving through the sky. It was hundreds of separate aircraft, each carrying its own crew and each exposed to its own sequence of events. The raid could be described later in totals, but the loss of DV-202 happened at the scale of 1 machine and 7 men. The raid did serious damage, but it was not cheap. 40 Bomber Command aircraft were lost that night. German fighters reached the bomber stream, and the later stages of the operation became increasingly dangerous. Somewhere in that confused night, DV-202 disappeared. The first official description of what happened to it was brief. A telegram from No. 44 Squadron, dated August 18th, identified Lancaster Mark III DV-202 and listed all 7 men aboard. The aircraft was missing. Its position was unknown, presumed to have been over the target. All 7 crewmen were missing. For the cause, the RAF used only a cautious phrase, presumed enemy action. That wording still matters. Later accounts have tried to identify the German night fighter responsible. Different names have been suggested, but the evidence does not allow the final seconds of DV-202 to be reconstructed with certainty. We know where the Lancaster ended up. We know it was lost in the Peenemünde area during a raid in which German fighters were active. We know the RAF believed enemy action was responsible. What we do not know with the same confidence is exactly who fired the shots that brought it down, what damage the bomber suffered before it descended, or precisely what happened in the cockpit during those final moments. Some later accounts suggest Harding may have tried to put the damaged aircraft down on the lake. That is possible, but it is not established firmly enough to treat as fact. The aircraft came down in Kilpiensee, close to Peenemünde, and all 7 men were lost. For many wartime losses, that would have been the end of the physical story. An aircraft vanished into the sea, burned on impact, or crashed somewhere that left little behind. DV-202 was different. The lake was shallow, and the wreck did not disappear completely. Over time, substantial remains of the Lancaster stayed in the water. But before the wreck became the focus, there was another question. What had happened to the crew? Wartime information suggested that at least some of the answer might be found on the shores of the lake. A later RAF casualty inquiry recorded German information stating that Stanley Shaw, William Quantz, and Leslie Prendergast had been buried on the south shore of Kolpensee on August 24, 1943. Peter Paniski was reported to have been buried on the west shore 3 days earlier. The same inquiry was careful about what it did not know. There was no corresponding information for Reginald Harding, Thomas Weston, or Leonard McDermott. The investigators were therefore being asked to do 2 things. They had to locate the reported graves, and they had to discover what had happened to the remaining members of the crew. On paper, the problem appeared solvable. There was a known crash area. There were wartime burial reports. There were specific parts of the lakeshore to search. After the war, RAF investigators went looking. They did not find what the records had led them to expect. By October 1949, the Air Ministry was writing to Stanley Shaw's wife with the result. The RAF Missing Research Organization had visited the Kelpensee area on numerous occasions in an attempt to locate the graves of Shaw and the other missing men. The searches had been unsuccessful. That failure left a gap that the surviving records do not close. It would be easy to invent an explanation. Graves may have been disturbed. Markers may have disappeared. Reports may have been inaccurate. Bodies may have been moved. But none of those possibilities can be turned into the answer without evidence. The responsible conclusion is simpler. Wartime reports said several members of the crew had been buried near the lake. Post-war RAF teams went there repeatedly. They could not find those graves. For Stanley Shaw's family, the official consequence was final. Without recovered remains or a confirmed grave, his name would be commemorated at the RAF Memorial to the missing at Runnymede. The crew remained missing. The wreck did not disappear. That difference between missing men and surviving machinery became more striking as the decades passed. Metal could remain where human evidence had disappeared. A fuselage section did not need a marker or a written record to continue occupying the same patch of water. It could be damaged, submerged, and altered by time, yet still be identifiable as part of an aircraft. The reported graves were different. Without confirmed remains, markers, or a recoverable burial site, investigators were left with documents that described something they could no longer locate. For the families, those 2 forms of evidence pointed in opposite directions. The official search for the men had reached a dead end. The wreck of the aircraft remained physically present. DV-202 therefore became something more complicated than a wartime crash site. It was a surviving object at the center of an unresolved human story. Kelpiensee preserved a physical trace that the paperwork could not erase. The bomber had come down in shallow water, and portions of the wreck remained visible or accessible long after the war. This created an unusual contrast. The RAF could not provide the families with a grave, yet the machine in which the men had died was still physically present at the place where it had fallen. For years, even the identity of that wreck carried some uncertainty. Later family and squadron accounts described divers and researchers connecting markings on the remains with DV-202, while official confirmation developed more cautiously. Over time, institutions including the International Bomber Command Center and the museum at Peenemünde came to identify the wreck in Kilpiensee as the remains of DV-202. The aircraft had disappeared from operations in one night. Its identification on the ground, or rather in the water, took much longer. Then, in 1991, something changed. One of the Lancaster's engines was recovered from the lake, together with its propeller. There is an archive photograph associated with that recovery, and the engine itself survives today at the Peenemünde Museum. The propeller remains bent, a visible reminder that this was not an engine removed from a serviceable aircraft. It came from a bomber that had been lying at its crash site for nearly half a century. For a recovery documentary, this is the point where the story usually becomes technical. A team arrives, divers descend, mud is cleared away, slings are placed, cables tighten, a crane takes the weight. The wreck resists, moves, breaks free, or fails. But with DV-202, those details are not securely documented in the evidence available to us. We know the result of the 1991 operation. An engine and propeller came out of Kulpinsee. We know where that assembly eventually went. What we cannot safely describe is the precise equipment used, the rigging, the preparation around the engine, the people responsible for each stage, or the exact reason the work stopped with that component. There is also no secure evidence that the 1991 recovery was the first phase of a planned attempt to raise the entire Lancaster. That distinction is important. It would make a more conventional story to say that a team tried to recover DV-202, removed an engine, and then failed to bring up the rest. But that would go beyond what the surviving sources establish. The aircraft may have been approached with much narrower intentions. The engine may have been the only component selected for removal. The wider reasons may have been practical, historical, legal, financial, or something else entirely. The documentation currently available does not answer the question. So the story has to stay with what can be seen. Before 1991, the surviving remains of DV-202 were concentrated at one wartime crash site. After 1991, they were divided. The engine and its bent propeller became a museum object. They could be examined indoors, protected from weather and water, displayed with the story of Operation Hydra and the aircraft that had been lost nearby. The fuselage stayed in Kulpinsee. That physical split created the image that still defines DV-202 today. A visitor can stand in a museum and look at one major part of the Lancaster, while only a short distance away the rest of the aircraft remains at the place where its final flight ended. The engine had been recovered. The story of the crew had not. More than a decade after the engine came ashore, the surviving wreck became the setting for a very different kind of return. Stanley Shaw had been one of DV-202's rear gunners. When he disappeared in 1943, his daughter Elaine was left without the certainty of a grave. In 1949, the family had been told that repeated RAF searches around the lake had failed to locate the reported burial place. In 2014, Elaine Towelson went to Kulpinsee. She traveled there with her son Russell during the making of a BBC documentary about the Lancaster. More than 70 years after the raid, they were able to approach the remains of the aircraft in the shallow lake. The significance of that moment did not need to be created by narration. Elaine described it herself. "It meant so much to me because I never got to say goodbye to my dad." There is a remarkable sequence hidden inside that one sentence. In 1943, Stanley Shaw disappeared with 6 other men. Wartime records suggested that some of the crew had been buried by the lake. After the war, RAF investigators searched for those graves and found nothing. In 1949, the family received official confirmation that the search had failed. Then, decades later, the aircraft itself was still there. The Lancaster could not provide the answer to every question about the crew. It could not explain what had happened to the reported burials. It could not identify the exact German pilot who had brought DV-202 down. It could not reconstruct the final moments inside the bomber. But it provided something the documents had never been able to give the family. A place. Not a confirmed grave, not recovered remains, not closure in the formal sense. A physical location connected directly to Stanley Shaw's final flight. And that changes how the wreck should be understood. For an aviation museum, DV-202's recovered engine is an artifact. It is part of the material history of Operation Hydra, Bomber Command, and the Lancaster. Its bent propeller remains one of the most visible traces of the crash, even though the exact moment or mechanism that produced the damage cannot be reconstructed. For historians, the wreck in the lake is another form of evidence. Its survival connects modern research with the terse wartime telegram that once listed 7 men as missing. For the family, however, the part that remained underwater could carry a meaning that the recovered engine could not. It stayed where the crew disappeared. That is why DV-202 does not fit the usual pattern of an aircraft recovery story. There was no triumphant restoration, no sequence of damaged components being rebuilt into a complete machine, no first engine start after decades of silence, no taxi test, no return to flight. Even the 1991 recovery is defined as much by what stayed behind as by what came out. Today, the two surviving locations tell different parts of the same story. Inside the historisch Technisches Museum Peenemünde, the engine and propeller can be viewed as a preserved object. They have been removed from the water, separated from the conditions that held them for decades, and placed inside a historical narrative visitors can walk around and examine. At Kolpiensee, the remaining wreck is not presented that way. It is still part of the place. The lake is not simply where historians later found DV-202. It is where the aircraft's final flight ended. It is where wartime reports placed the burials of several crew members. It is where RF investigators later searched and failed to locate those graves. It is where the surviving structure of the Lancaster remained while one of its engines was taken away. That continuity is more important than any invented salvage drama. There are still questions. The exact night fighter responsible for the loss remains disputed in later accounts. The precise sequence of DV-202's final descent cannot be proved. The fate of the graves reported in wartime documents remains unresolved. The reason the 1991 recovery stopped with an engine and propeller, rather than becoming the removal of the entire aircraft, is not established by the available evidence. Those are not gaps to be filled with confident guesses. They are part of what survives. DV-202 is a case where the physical remains are unusually visible, but the historical record is still incomplete. The bomber can be located. One of its engines can be visited. The men can be named. The mission can be reconstructed in broad outline. Yet the final moments, the missing graves, and the limits of the recovery still resist a complete answer. And perhaps that is why the surviving image is so effective. The story begins with one Lancaster in two places. It ends there too. One part of DV-202 hangs inside a museum at Peenemünde, its propeller still bent from a wartime loss. The other part remains in the shallow water of Kolpiensee, close to where the bomber disappeared during Operation Hydra on the night of August 17th and 18th, 1943. 7 men boarded that aircraft. None returned. For years, investigators searched the shoreline for graves that wartime reports said should have been there. They found none. Decades later, one engine was brought out of the lake and preserved. The fuselage was left where the aircraft had come down. And more than 70 years after Stanley Shaw disappeared, his daughter could finally travel to that place and stand beside the surviving wreck. The museum preserved the piece that was recovered. The lake preserved the piece that was not. One engine came out of Kolpiensee. Lancaster DV-202 never did.